I started visiting Centralia in the fall of 2009. I was 19 back then, a sophomore at Penn State majoring in photography, and I'd become obsessed with documenting abandoned places across Pennsylvania. There was something haunting about structures left to decay, about towns that had been forgotten by everyone except the earth itself. Centralia was the crown jewel of abandonment in our state. Most people knew the basic story: an underground coal fire that had been burning since 1962, toxic fumes rising through cracks in the ground, a government buyout that turned a community of over 1,000 people into a ghost town with less than 10 residents who refused to leave. The famous graffiti highway had become a pilgrimage site for urban explorers and photographers like me. I'd been planning the trip for weeks. I convinced 2 friends from my dorm to come along. Massimo was my roommate, a laid-back guy from Philadelphia who was always up for an adventure, and Oakland was a girl from my intro to digital media class who had her own camera and a genuine interest in the project. We left campus early on a Saturday morning in October, driving my beat-up Honda through the mountain roads of central Pennsylvania as the leaves blazed orange and red around us. The drive took about 2 hours, and by the time we arrived in what remained of Centralia, the autumn sun was climbing toward noon, casting long shadows across the cracked and buckled highway. The first thing that struck me was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of sound you'd expect from any living place. No traffic, no voices, no dogs barking or lawnmowers running. Just wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. We parked near the graffiti highway, that famous stretch of Route 61 that had been closed and abandoned, now covered in layers upon layers of spray paint. People had turned it into an outdoor art gallery of sorts. Every inch of asphalt decorated with messages, murals, and tags. Oakland immediately started shooting photos, fascinated by the colors against the gray October sky. Massimo and I wandered toward the grid of empty streets where houses used to stand. Most of the homes had been demolished after the buyout, leaving just concrete foundations and crumbling steps that led to nowhere. Here and there, a structure still stood, boarded up and tagged with no trespassing signs that everyone ignored. The ground felt warm beneath my feet in places, and I could see steam or smoke rising from cracks in the earth, visual proof of the inferno burning in the coal seams below us. It was surreal, walking through a town that was literally being consumed from underneath, where the ground itself was the enemy. We spent about an hour exploring and taking photos before Massimo spotted something interesting. A house that was still mostly intact, set back from the main grid on what looked like an old service road. The structure was a small Cape Cod-style home, probably built in the 40s or 50s, with faded yellow siding and a sagging front porch. Most of the windows were broken or boarded over, but it looked more preserved than the other ruins we'd seen. We approached carefully, testing each step on the porch before committing our weight. The front door hung open on one hinge, and we slipped inside. The interior was what you'd expect: water damage, collapsed ceiling tiles, graffiti on the walls, debris scattered across warped floorboards. But there was something else too, a feeling I couldn't quite name. The air felt heavier in there, denser somehow, and several degrees warmer than it should have been. Oakland mentioned it too, pointing out that we could see our breath outside but not in here. We figured it was because of the underground fire, heat rising through the foundation. We moved through the main floor, photographing the decay, the way nature was reclaiming the space. In what had been the kitchen, wildflowers were growing up through cracks in the linoleum. That's when we heard it. A knocking sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below us. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more knocks. It was so clear and distinct that we all froze, looking at each other to confirm we'd all heard the same thing. Massimo laughed nervously and said it was probably the house settling, or pipes expanding from the heat underground. But the knocking came again, the same pattern. 3 deliberate strikes, pause, 3 more. It sounded like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. Oakland asked if there were other urban explorers in the basement, but that didn't make sense. We would have seen another car. We were the only people here. I found the basement door in a small hallway off the kitchen. It was closed, and someone had spray-painted a red X across it, with the words "Do Not" written underneath in drippy letters. The knocking came again, louder now that we were right next to the door, and I could feel the vibration of it through the wood. My hand was on the doorknob before I really thought about what I was doing. It turned easily, and I pulled the door open to reveal a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. The smell that rose up was overwhelming. Damp earth, rot, and something else, something chemical and harsh that made my eyes water. The knocking had stopped the moment I opened the door. We stood there for a long moment, staring down into that black space. Massimo pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it down the stairs. The beam didn't penetrate very far, but we could see that the stairs were intact and the basement floor was dirt, not concrete. I called out a hello, my voice sounding small and foolish. Nothing answered. Oakland said we should leave, that this felt wrong, but I was already starting down the stairs. I can't fully explain why. Curiosity, maybe, or that stubborn photographer's instinct to document everything. I told them to wait at the top if they wanted, but I was going to look. The stairs creaked under my weight but held. Massimo followed behind me, and after a moment, I heard Oakland coming too. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching beyond the footprint of the house above. The floor was indeed bare earth, packed down hard, and the walls were rough stone foundation on two sides, open earth on the others, like someone had dug the space larger. In the center of the room stood an old coal furnace, a hulking iron beast that probably hadn't been used in decades. But what caught my attention was what sat in front of the furnace: a camping chair, the folding kind, and next to it, a battery-operated lantern that was turned off but looked relatively new. There were other items too scattered around this little living area. A sleeping bag rolled up against the wall, several plastic water bottles, some empty, some full, and a milk crate being used as a table with food wrappers and a paperback book on top. Someone had been living down here, maybe was still living down here. The realization hit all three of us at the same time. Massimo grabbed my arm and said we needed to leave immediately, but I was already moving toward the furnace, my camera up, documenting everything. That's when I noticed the footprints. The dirt floor was covered in them, most old and scuffed, but some that looked fresh, recent. They were bare footprints, and they were everywhere, pacing patterns back and forth, circles around the furnace, leading to the far corner of the basement, where the foundation met raw earth. I followed them with my light and saw something that made my stomach drop. A low tunnel, maybe 3 feet high, that had been dug into the earth itself, leading away into darkness. The tunnel was shored up with old lumber and pieces of metal, crude but intentional. Someone had dug this. Someone had expanded this basement into the coal seams below. The knocking started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the tunnel, echoing up from somewhere deep in the earth, and it was getting closer. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks, but faster now, more urgent. Oakland screamed and bolted for the stairs. Massimo and I were right behind her, stumbling and crashing up the wooden steps in blind panic. Behind us, the knocking continued, growing louder, and I swear I heard something else too. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across dirt. We burst out of the basement into the hallway, and I slammed the door shut behind us. The knocking stopped immediately. We didn't speak as we rushed through the house and out onto the porch. The afternoon sunlight felt shocking after the darkness of that basement, too bright and too normal. We were halfway back to the car when Oakland pointed at the ground and asked what that was. We looked down and saw footprints in the ash and dirt that covered this part of town. Bare footprints, the same size and shape as the ones in the basement, leading from the side of the house we'd just left. But these prints were fresh, made recently, and they didn't lead back to the house. They led away from it, toward the tree line, toward an area where we could see smoke or steam rising more heavily from the ground. We followed them with our eyes and saw where they ended, at what looked like an old mine entrance, a black opening in a hillside that had been sealed at some point with concrete blocks, but the blocks had been broken away, leaving a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Massimo said something I'll never forget. What if someone was actually living down there, in the mines themselves, in the burning tunnels beneath Centralia, and they'd only come up to that basement to access supplies or to get away from the worst of the heat? What if that's why the knocking followed us, why it seemed to move? They were moving through the tunnels below, tracking us by sound. The idea was insane, impossible. No one could survive down there with the heat and the toxic gases. But we'd all seen the evidence. The camping supplies, the fresh footprints, the tunnel dug deeper into the earth. Someone or something was living beneath this dead town. We got back to the car as fast as we could without running. As I fumbled with my keys, I looked back at that hillside, at the broken mine entrance, and I saw something that still haunts me. Smoke was rising more heavily from the opening now, billowing out like breath. And in the darkness of that gap, I swear I saw movement. Something pale, something that pulled back deeper into the shadows when it realized I was looking. We were in the car and driving before I could process what I'd seen. None of us spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive. When we finally did talk, we made a pact not to tell anyone about what we'd found, but the story ate at me. I did research when I got back to campus. I learned about the extensive mine system beneath Centralia, miles and miles of tunnels, some still accessible despite the fire. I read about the few remaining residents, the holdouts who refused to leave, but they all lived in the handful of houses that were still standing on the surface. I found old news articles about urban explorers who'd gone missing near Centralia over the years, though most were assumed to have fallen into unstable mine shafts or been overcome by carbon monoxide. I never went back to Centralia. Massimo transferred to a different school the next semester, and though we never talked about why, I think that day stayed with him the same way it stayed with me. Oakland deleted all her photos from that trip and asked me to do the same. I couldn't bring myself to delete mine. Sometimes I still look at them, at the pictures I took in that basement, and I zoom in on the shadows near that tunnel entrance, trying to see if there's anything there, any evidence of what was making those sounds. I never find anything conclusive, but I also can't shake the feeling that something was down there, something that had adapted to living in that burning underworld, and we'd stumbled into its home. My name is Layla, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me back in 2010 when I was working as a real estate agent in Harrisburg. I'd been in the business for about 6 years at that point, doing well enough, making decent commissions on suburban homes and the occasional commercial property. I grew up in central Pennsylvania, and my grandmother was Pennsylvania Dutch, so I knew the folklore, the old superstitions about hexes and powwow magic that still lingered in some of the rural areas. My grandmother used to tell me stories about braucherei, the folk healing practices, and about the hex doctors who could cure illness or place curses. I never took it seriously. It was just colorful family history, something that belonged to another century. That changed when I got assigned to handle the sale of a property in southern York County, not far from where the famous Hex murder happened back in 1928. The property came to our agency through an estate sale. The previous owner, an elderly man who'd lived alone, had died of natural causes, and his distant relatives who inherited the place wanted nothing to do with it. They hired us to sell it as quickly as possible, price it to move, get it off their hands. The listing described it as a farmhouse on 12 acres, built in the early 1900s, needs updating but structurally sound. The photos they'd sent were dark and unflattering, typical of estate sales where nobody wants to invest in staging or professional photography. My boss assigned it to me because I'd grown up in the area and understood the local market. I drove out there on a Tuesday afternoon in late March to assess the property and figure out what we were working with. The house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by bare fields and patches of woods that were just starting to show the first hints of spring green. It was a 2-story farmhouse with weathered white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged on one side. The whole place had an air of neglect, like it had been slowly dying along with its owner. I let myself in with the lockbox key and started my walkthrough, taking notes on what would need to be disclosed and what minor improvements might help it sell faster. The interior was dusty and cluttered, with the accumulated possessions of someone who'd lived there for decades. Furniture from different eras crowded the rooms, newspapers stacked in corners, the musty smell of a house that hadn't been properly aired out in years. What struck me immediately were the symbols. They were everywhere, painted on the walls, carved into door frames, drawn on pieces of paper that had been tacked up in odd places. Hex signs, protective symbols from Pennsylvania Dutch tradition, the kind you'd see decoratively painted on barns, except these weren't decorative. They were crude, obsessive, layered over each other in some places like whoever put them there was desperate. There were distelfinks, the birds that represented good, fortune, and hexafoils, the 6-petaled rosettes that were supposed to bring protection. But there were other symbols too, ones I didn't recognize, angular and strange, that made me uncomfortable to look at. Over every door, on every windowsill, even on the bathroom mirror, someone had painted or drawn these protective marks. I made a note that we'd need to paint over all of this before showing the house. Potential buyers would think the previous owner was disturbed or paranoid, and it would hurt our chances of getting a decent offer. I spent about an hour measuring rooms and taking my own photos, trying to envision how the place could be staged to appeal to buyers looking for a fixer-upper with land. Before I left, I did something I probably shouldn't have. In the back bedroom, there was a large symbol painted directly on the hardwood floor, a complex geometric design that had been created with what looked like red paint. It was right in the center of the room, impossible to miss, and it would definitely need to be sanded away before we could show the property. I took a photo of it for our records. Then, without really thinking about it, I scuffed my shoe across part of the design, testing whether it was going to be difficult to remove. The paint flaked away easily. I remember feeling satisfied that it wouldn't require extensive floor refinishing. I drove back to Harrisburg and wrote up my assessment. I recommended that we invest about $3,000 in basic staging, paint over the symbols, clean out the clutter, maybe rent some neutral furniture for the main rooms. My boss approved the budget, and I hired a crew to go out there that weekend to start the work. I specifically told them to paint over or remove all the strange markings throughout the house. Make it look normal, lived in, but not weird. They spent 2 days out there, and when they finished, I went back to check their work. The house looked 100 times better. Fresh, neutral paint, the floors cleaned and polished. The oppressive feeling of the place lightened considerably. We scheduled our first showing for that Thursday. The trouble started that night. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving in my apartment. I lived alone in a second-floor unit with good locks and security, so I knew I should have been the only person there. But I could hear footsteps in my living room, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, and crept to my bedroom door. When I looked out, there was nothing there. The apartment was empty, dark, exactly as I'd left it. But I could still hear the footsteps, fainter now, like they were moving away from me. Then they stopped. I convinced myself I'd been dreaming, that it was just the stress of work and the unsettling atmosphere of that farmhouse getting into my head. I went back to bed, but didn't sleep well. The next day, I had 3 showings scheduled at the York County property. The first 2 went fine. though neither couple seemed particularly interested. The third showing was with a young family, and they seemed promising until we got to the back bedroom, the one where I'd scuffed away that symbol on the floor. The wife took one look into the room and refused to enter. She said it felt wrong, that something bad had happened there, and she needed to leave immediately. Her husband tried to calm her down, but she was adamant, practically running for the front door. They left, and I was alone in the house again, frustrated because they'd actually seemed like serious buyers. That's when I noticed the symbols were back. Not all of them, but enough. On the doorframe of the back bedroom, I could see faint marks bleeding through the fresh paint, like the old protective signs were reasserting themselves. In the kitchen, one of the windowsills had a symbol scratched into the wood that I was certain hadn't been there after the cleaning crew finished. I took photos and called the crew supervisor, asking if they'd actually removed everything like I'd specified. He insisted they had, sent me before and after photos from his own phone to prove it. But standing there in that house, I could see the symbols coming back. Over the next week, things got worse. The footsteps in my apartment became a nightly occurrence, always at 3 in the morning, always the same pacing pattern. Items in my home started moving on their own. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them in the bathroom. My car keys ended up in the refrigerator. Books I'd never touched were pulled off shelves. I started feeling watched constantly, that prickly sensation of eyes on you even when you're alone. At the farmhouse, the symbols kept reappearing no matter how many times we painted over them. We repainted that back bedroom twice, and both times within 24 hours, the marks would bleed through or reappear carved into surfaces that had been smooth. I stopped sleeping. I was exhausted, paranoid, jumping at shadows. My boss was getting frustrated because the property wasn't moving and I kept requesting more money for maintenance and painting. Other agents in the office started avoiding me because I looked and acted like I was falling apart. That's when Rhea found me. She was an older woman, probably in her 70s, who walked into our office on a Friday afternoon and asked specifically for me by name. She said she'd heard I was handling the estate sale on the old farmhouse in York County, and she needed to speak with me privately about it. We went to a coffee shop down the street, and she told me things about that property that had never been in any listing or public record. The man who'd lived there, the one who died, hadn't been a hermit by choice. He'd been protecting something, or protecting himself from something. Decades ago, apparently, something had been bound to that property through powwow magic, something that had tried to harm the family that lived there before him. The protective symbols throughout the house weren't paranoia. They were necessity. They were the only things keeping whatever was bound there from manifesting fully, from causing real harm. When I'd scuffed away that symbol in the back bedroom, when my crew had painted over and removed the protective marks, I'd broken the bindings. I'd let it loose. And worse, by being the one to break the primary seal, I'd connected myself to it. It was following me now, manifesting in my space, because I was the one who'd freed it. Rhea said she was a Brockeren, a practitioner of the old folk magic, and she could help me, but I needed to do exactly what she told me. We drove back to the farmhouse that evening, and she brought with her a bag of supplies: salt, iron nails, red ochre paint, and a small book written in German that she said contained the necessary verses. We spent hours in that house, with Rhea repainting the symbols properly, speaking words in Pennsylvania Dutch dialect that I only partially understood, placing iron nails at specific points in the foundation. She made me participate in the ritual, made me speak the words after her, made me paint some of the symbols myself with my own hands. The whole time the house felt wrong, like it was resisting us, like something was pressing against the walls from the inside trying to get out. The worst part came in that back bedroom. Rhea made me stand in the center where the floor symbol had been, and she drew a new one around me using the red ochre. She told me I needed to bind it back myself, that because I'd been the one to break the seal, I was the only one who could properly restore it. She gave me words to say, a binding verse, and I spoke them while she worked. I felt something in that room with us. Something furious and cold. And I swear I saw shadows moving against the walls that had nothing to do with our flashlights. Rhea worked faster, her hands shaking, and she kept telling me to keep speaking. Don't stop. Don't let it interrupt the binding. When she finally finished the last symbol and spoke the final words, something in the house sighed. A sound like wind through a tunnel, and the oppressive feeling lifted just slightly. Rhea told me the binding would hold, but the house was dangerous and always would be. She said I needed to withdraw the listing immediately, that the property should never be sold to an unsuspecting family. When I got back to the office that Monday, I told my boss I couldn't handle the listing anymore, made up an excuse about a conflict of interest. He reassigned it to another agent, and I never followed up on what happened with the sale. The footsteps in my apartment stopped that night. The items stopped moving. Whatever had been following me was gone, pulled back to that farmhouse, and bound there again by the symbols and the ritual. But I never forgot. 2 months later, I quit real estate entirely. I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't walk into empty houses without wondering what might be waiting there, what protective measures previous owners might have had in place that we'd carelessly remove for the sake of staging and sales. I work in medical billing now, boring and safe, and I've never gone back to York County. I looked up the property records a few years ago out of morbid curiosity, and the farmhouse is still there, still owned by the estate. It never sold. Maybe the other agent figured out something was wrong with it, or maybe whatever was bound there made sure no sale could go through. I don't know, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that the old superstitions, the folk magic that my grandmother told me about, the protective hexes and bindings, they weren't just folklore. They were real, functional, necessary. And I learned the hard way what happens when you dismiss them as primitive nonsense and break protections that were put in place for very good reasons. Have you ever removed or destroyed something in an old house that you later realized might have been there for protection? Tell me in the comments what happened. My name is Ruben, and what happened to me in the fall of 2008 still keeps me up at night. I was 42 years old then, working as a long-haul truck driver for a logistics company out of Pittsburgh. I'd been driving routes across Pennsylvania and neighboring states for almost 15 years, knew the highways and back roads like the lines on my own hands. The job was solitary, which suited me fine after my divorce. Just me, the radio, and the endless stretch of asphalt. I'd driven through Renovo a handful of times before that October night, usually in daylight, passing through on Route 120 without giving the town much thought. It was one of those places that had seen better days, a former railroad and lumber hub that time and economics had left behind. Population maybe 1,300 on a good day, the kind of town where most young people leave as soon as they can and never look back. That particular night, I was hauling auto parts from a distribution center in Clearfield to a facility outside of Lock Haven. It was a straightforward run, maybe 90 miles, and I'd planned to be unloaded and heading home by midnight. Everything went fine until about 10 miles outside of Renovo, when my rig started making a sound no driver wants to hear, a grinding screech from somewhere in the drivetrain that meant I was going nowhere fast. I managed to limp off the highway onto a side road before the truck died completely. I tried calling my dispatcher, but cell service out there was non-existent, just dead air and a no signal message on my phone. I grabbed my flashlight and my jacket and stepped out to assess the damage, already knowing I was looking at a long night. The side road I'd pulled onto ran parallel to what looked like an abandoned industrial site, all rusted metal and collapsing structures barely visible in the darkness. Old sawmill, I figured, or maybe railroad maintenance buildings from when Renovo had been a thriving hub. The air smelled like pine and rot and old machinery. It was cold that night, probably in the low 40s, and the wind coming down from the mountains had teeth. I checked under the truck with my flashlight, confirmed what I'd suspected. a major mechanical failure that wasn't getting fixed without a tow in a shop. I was stuck there until morning when I could walk into town and find help. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and settled in to wait out the night. I'd done it before, sleeping in the cab between runs, but something about that location felt off. The darkness seemed heavier there, thicker somehow, and the wind moving through those abandoned structures created sounds that were almost like voices, low murmurs and whispers that my rational mind knew were just air moving through broken windows and gaps in walls. I tried the radio, but all I got was static. I tried my phone again with the same result. Eventually, I reclined the seat as far as it would go and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I first saw them, but it had to be past 2 in the morning. Movement outside caught my eye, and when I sat up and looked through the windshield, I saw children. 4 of them, maybe 5, standing near the entrance to the old mill site about 50 yards ahead of my truck. They were just standing there in a loose group, not moving, not playing, just existing in the darkness. Even from that distance, I could tell something was wrong with their clothing. It looked old-fashioned, like something from a century ago. Long dresses on the girls, and knee-length pants with suspenders on the boys. No coats, even though it was freezing out there. My first thought was that some local kids were playing around in the ruins, though what kids would be out at that hour in that location made no sense. I watched them for a few minutes, trying to decide if I should get out and tell them to go home when they started moving. Not walking exactly, but gliding, their feet not quite connecting with the ground in the way they should. They moved toward my truck in formation, staying together, their faces pale blurs in the darkness. That's when real fear hit me. That primal animal part of your brain that knows when something is fundamentally wrong. I reached over and made sure my doors were locked, even though I knew locked doors wouldn't matter if something truly wrong was happening. They kept coming, closing the distance between us with that strange floating movement, and as they got closer, I could see their faces more clearly. Children, yes, but wrong. Their eyes were too dark, holes in their faces, and their mouths were open but motionless, like they were frozen mid-scream. Their skin had a waxy quality, not quite real, not quite solid. When they reached my truck, they spread out, surrounding the cab, 3 on the driver's side and 2 on the passenger side. They stood there, inches from the windows, staring in at me with those empty eyes. One of them, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old in life, slowly raised her hand and pressed it against the driver's side window. I expected to feel the impact, expected to hear the sound of her palm against glass, but there was nothing. Her hand went through the window like it wasn't there, and I could see her fingers extending into the cab, gray and translucent, reaching for me. I jerked back against my seat, pressing myself as far from the window as I could get, and the hand withdrew. But they didn't leave. They just stood there, surrounding my truck, staring at me with those awful empty eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. I don't know how long they stayed like that. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. I couldn't move, couldn't think, could barely breathe. I just sat there frozen while they watched me. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned away in unison and glided back toward the mill ruins, moving in that same eerie formation until they disappeared into the shadows of the collapsed buildings. I sat in that cab shaking for another hour before I could convince myself to move. When the sky finally started to lighten with approaching dawn, I unlocked the door and stepped out. The ground around my truck was covered in frost, and in that frost, I could see marks where they'd stood, small footprints that circled the entire cab. But the prints were wrong. They were too shallow, barely impressions, as if whatever had made them weighed almost nothing. I walked into Renovo as soon as there was enough light to see the road, found a diner that was just opening, and the woman working there let me use her phone to call for a tow. While I waited, I asked her about the old mill site, trying to sound casual about it. She got quiet for a moment, then told me I should stay away from there, especially at night. When I pressed her, she said there'd been a fire at that mill back in 1897, a devastating fire that killed 23 workers and burned down the company housing where their families lived. A lot of children died that night, trapped in buildings that went up like kindling. She said people had been seeing things out there for over a century, that it was a known, haunted location that locals avoided after dark. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. What was the point? She'd either think I was crazy or she'd confirm what I already knew, that those children I'd seen were the ones who died in that fire, still trapped somehow in the location of their death, still trying to make sense of what had happened to them. The tow truck came around 9 that morning and hauled my rig to a repair shop in town. The mechanic said it would take 2 days to get the parts and fix the damage, so I got a motel room and tried to rest. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces, those empty eyes and open mouths, those reaching hands passing through solid glass. On the second night, I made the mistake of driving past the mill site again. I don't know why I did it. Morbid curiosity, maybe, or some need to prove to myself that what I'd seen hadn't been real, that exhaustion and isolation had created a hallucination. I parked on the road about 100 yards away and watched the ruins as darkness fell. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just after 10 o'clock, I saw lights moving among the buildings, small flickering lights like candles or lanterns. And I saw them again, the children, more of them this time, maybe a dozen, moving through the ruins in their old-fashioned clothes, carrying those lights, playing or searching or reenacting something from their lost lives. I didn't stay to watch more. I drove back to the motel and stayed there until my truck was ready. I picked up my rig 2 days later and finished my delivery run. I didn't tell anyone at my company what had happened, just filed a report about the mechanical failure and the delay, but I requested different routes after that, asked to be kept away from that part of Pennsylvania if possible. My dispatcher thought I was being superstitious, gave me grief about it, but eventually accommodated my request. I haven't been back to Renovo since 2008, haven't driven that stretch of Route 120, and I never will again. I still drive trucks, still make my runs across Pennsylvania, but I'm careful now about where I stop, where I spend the night. I look up the history of places before I park anywhere isolated, check to see if there were any tragedies, any fires or accidents or deaths that might have left something behind, because that's what I learned that night outside of Renovo. Some tragedies are so profound, so terrible, that they don't just fade into history. They leave marks, impressions, echoes of the people who died and the moment of their death. Those children were still there, still trapped in the night they burned, still trying to understand what had happened to them and why the world had become dark and cold and empty. They saw my truck, saw light and warmth and a living person, and they were drawn to it, maybe hoping I could help them, maybe just desperate for any connection to the world they'd lost. I couldn't help them. Nobody can. All I could do was survive the encounter and carry the memory of those faces with me. A reminder that the past doesn't always stay buried, and some places should be left alone after the sun goes down. I've talked to other drivers over the years, traded stories at truck stops and rest areas, and I've heard similar accounts from guys who've driven through that region. Sightings near old industrial sites, encounters with things that shouldn't exist, places where the normal rules don't quite apply. Most drivers won't talk about it openly because they don't want to sound crazy. But when you get them alone, when they trust you, they'll admit they've seen things they can't explain. Pennsylvania is full of places like that mill in Renovo, locations where history and tragedy created something that persists, where the boundary between then and now gets thin enough that the past can bleed through. I respect that now in a way I never did before that October night. I give those places a wide berth, and I make sure I'm never broken down and stranded near them when darkness falls. Have you ever seen something at night near an abandoned building that made you question what's really possible? Drop your experience in the comments below. My name is Kinley, and I was 14 years old in the summer of 1982 when something happened that changed how I see the world. I grew up in Wilkes-Barre, born there in 1968, and my whole family had deep roots in the Wyoming Valley. My parents and grandparents had all survived Hurricane Agnes in 1972, that catastrophic flood that devastated our region and killed dozens of people. 10 years later, the scars were still visible everywhere you looked. Condemned buildings waiting for demolition, empty lots where homes used to stand, entire neighborhoods that had been wiped off the map and never rebuilt. The flood was part of our family identity, part of who we were as a community. My mother kept newspaper clippings about it in a scrapbook, and my father would point out landmarks that no longer existed, telling stories about what used to be there before the Susquehanna River rose up and swallowed everything. That July, my best friends Cleo and Jolene and I were doing what teenagers did back then during summer break. Looking for adventure, pushing boundaries, exploring places we probably shouldn't have been exploring. There was a whole section of South Wilkes-Barre that was still abandoned a decade after the flood. Streets of condemned houses that the city hadn't gotten around to demolishing yet. Some were just empty shells, but others still had furniture inside, personal belongings left behind when families evacuated and never returned. It was eerie and fascinating, like walking through a neighborhood frozen in time. We'd been exploring these streets for a few weeks, taking photographs with Cleo's camera, collecting small items we found interesting, treating it like our own private museum of recent history. The house we found that day was on a corner lot, a 2-story brick structure that looked more intact than most of the others. The windows were boarded up, and there was the standard yellow condemnation notice on the front door, but the building itself seemed solid. Cleo noticed that the side basement window had been broken, the boards pried away, leaving an opening large enough to climb through. We looked at each other with that specific kind of excitement that comes from knowing you're about to do something forbidden. Jolene went first, dropping down into the darkness below, then Cleo, then me. We landed on a concrete floor in what had been the basement, using our flashlights to survey the space. The basement was mostly empty, water-stained and musty, with that distinctive smell of mold and decay that marked every flood-damaged building in our area. Old furniture was stacked against one wall, ruined and falling apart. We moved through carefully, aware that the floor above us might not be stable, that we were trespassing in a structure that could collapse at any moment. That danger was part of the thrill. We found the stairs leading up to the main floor and climbed them slowly, testing each step before putting our full weight on it. The first floor was more interesting, still furnished like someone might return at any moment. A living room with a couch and chairs, a television console from the early 70s, bookshelves with paperbacks swollen from water damage, family photos in frames on the mantle, their images faded and water-spotted but still visible. Jolene picked up one of the photos, a family portrait showing parents and 3 children posed in front of a Christmas tree. She wondered aloud what had happened to them, whether they'd survived the flood, whether they'd rebuilt somewhere else or left the valley entirely. We moved through the kitchen, opening cabinets that still held dishes and glasses, looking through drawers that contained utensils and old receipts, and the mundane debris of daily life interrupted. Then Cleo noticed something odd about the kitchen wall. There was a section that sounded hollow when she knocked on it, and when we looked closer, we could see seams in the plaster that suggested a door or opening had been covered over. The plaster was damaged from the flood, cracking and bulging, and when Cleo pressed against it, a chunk fell away, revealing darkness behind the wall. We pulled more of the damaged plaster away until we'd opened a gap large enough to see through. Behind the false wall was a small room, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and no other entrance. We shined our flashlights inside and saw something that made my skin go cold. The room was full of children's shoes, dozens and dozens of them, arranged on shelves that lined 3 walls. Little shoes, the kind kids would have worn in the 60s and 70s, some worn and scuffed, others that looked almost new. And there were photographs, hundreds of them, covering the back wall in overlapping layers. Photographs of children, all different ages, all candid shots taken from a distance or through windows. None of them posed or aware they were being photographed. We stood there, frozen, trying to process what we were seeing. This wasn't just creepy, it was evidence of something deeply wrong, something criminal. Someone had been collecting these items, these photographs, creating this secret shrine to children they'd been watching or following or worse. Jolene wanted to leave immediately, to get out of that house and never come back. But I was drawn to those photographs, compelled to look at them more closely. I climbed through the gap we'd created and entered that hidden room, my flashlight beam moving across the faces on the wall. That's when I saw it. One of the photographs showed my mother as a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. She was wearing a dress I'd seen in old family photos, her hair in the style of the early 60s. I pulled the photograph off the wall with shaking hands and brought it closer to my light. It was definitely her. Absolutely no question, but my mother had never mentioned this photo being taken. The angle suggested it had been shot from across the street or from a car, a candid image captured without her knowledge. I looked at the other photos more carefully now, studying the faces, and I recognized 2 more children from my neighborhood, kids who would now be adults in their 30s, captured in these secret photographs decades ago. Whoever had created this room had been targeting children in Wilkes-Barre, photographing them, collecting their shoes somehow, for years or maybe decades. Cleo and Jolene were calling for me to come out, their voices tight with fear, but I kept searching through the items in that room. There were other things too, locks of hair in small envelopes with dates written on them, children's drawings that looked like they'd been taken from trash cans or found abandoned, a ledger book with names and addresses, and detailed observations written in cramped handwriting. I grabbed the ledger and the photograph of my mother and climbed back out of that hidden room. We needed to get out of there and call the police, needed to report what we'd found so someone could investigate properly. We were halfway across the kitchen when we heard it. Footsteps on the floor above us, slow and deliberate, moving across the ceiling. Someone else was in the house. We froze, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps moved to what sounded like the stairway. Jolene grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the basement stairs, and we ran, all 3 of us stumbling down into the darkness and scrambling for the broken window we'd entered through. I went through first this time, scraping my arms on the broken glass, not caring, just desperate to get out. Cleo came after me, then Jolene, and we ran down that street without looking back. Ran until we were 6 blocks away and couldn't run anymore. We went to my house because it was closest. My parents were both at work, and we sat in the kitchen trying to decide what to do. I showed them the photograph of my mother and the ledger I'd taken, and we flipped through pages of observations about children throughout the city, detailed notes about their routines, where they went to school, what time they walked home, what activities they participated in. It was a predator's documentation, years and years of surveillance and stalking. Jolene insisted we call the police immediately, and Cleo agreed. So I dialed the non-emergency number and tried to explain what we'd found. The officer I spoke to seemed skeptical at first, probably thinking we were kids with overactive imaginations. But when I gave him the address and started describing the hidden room and the photographs, his tone changed. He said officers would be dispatched to investigate and that we should stay where we were. 2 police officers arrived at my house about 40 minutes later. We took them through everything we'd seen, showed them the photograph and the ledger, explained exactly where the house was and how to access the hidden room. They took our statements seriously, asked detailed questions, and left with the items we'd taken as evidence. Over the next few days, we learned bits and pieces about the investigation. Police had gone to the house and confirmed everything we'd reported. The hidden room was real. The photographs and shoes and hair samples were all there. They'd tried to trace ownership of the property and identify who might have created that shrine, but the records were incomplete due to flood damage, and the previous owner of record had died in 1974. There was no clear suspect, no obvious person to investigate. My mother was horrified when police showed her the photograph of herself as a child. She had no memory of it being taken, no recollection of ever noticing someone following her or photographing her. The police contacted some of the other people we'd identified in the photographs, adults now, and none of them had any awareness that they'd been targeted or watched as children. The investigation eventually went cold. Without a suspect and without any evidence of actual crimes beyond the disturbing collection itself, there was nothing to prosecute. The house was demolished later that year as part of the ongoing flood recovery efforts, and the evidence was filed away in some police archive. But the questions never went away for me. Who had created that room? What had they done beyond just collecting photographs and shoes? Had they actually harmed any children? Or had the collection been the extent of their pathology? How many years had they been operating? And how had they remained undetected in a small city where everyone knew everyone? And the question that haunted me most: why my mother? What had drawn this person's attention to her specifically? And what might have happened if circumstances had been different? If the flood hadn't come and destroyed everything? If that person had still been alive and active in 1982? I'm 56 years old now, married with children and grandchildren of my own, still living in northeastern Pennsylvania, though not in Wilkes-Barre itself. I've never forgotten that hidden room, or those photographs, or the sick feeling of seeing my mother's childhood face staring out from that wall of surveillance. I became hyper-vigilant as a parent, maybe overly protective, always aware of where my children were and who might be watching them. The flood that devastated our region in 1972 revealed that hidden room by damaging the walls, exposing a secret that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. I think about how many other secrets might be buried in condemned buildings or abandoned houses, waiting to be discovered or waiting to crumble into dust with no one ever knowing they existed. The police never solved it, never identified who created that shrine or what their ultimate intentions were. For all I know, they moved away after the flood like thousands of other residents did, taking their secrets with them, starting over in another community where no one knew. Their history. That possibility terrifies me more than anything. The idea that someone capable of that level of obsession and predation could simply disappear into the general population and continue whatever they'd been doing somewhere else. I've told this story to very few people over the years because it sounds unbelievable, like something from a horror movie rather than real life in a Pennsylvania city. But it happened exactly as I've described it, and somewhere in a police evidence room, those photographs and that ledger still exist as proof. What would you do if you discovered evidence of a crime that happened decades ago but couldn't be solved? Share your thoughts in the comments. My name is Alec, and I need to share what happened on my farm in Lancaster County during the autumn of 2017. I'm Mennonite, born and raised in this community, and I've worked the same 200 acres my whole adult life, land that my grandfather purchased in the 1950s and passed down to my father, who passed it to me. We grow corn, soybeans, and hay, rotating crops the way generations before us have done, living simply and working hard. I was 28 that year, married with 2 young children, living the life I'd always expected to live. Our farm sits about 3 miles outside of Intercourse, surrounded by other Mennonite and Amish properties, part of a community that still values traditional ways and mutual support among neighbors. It started in late September with the livestock deaths. I keep a small herd of dairy cattle, about 20 head, and one morning I found one of my best milking cows dead in the pasture. At first glance, I thought maybe she'd been struck by lightning, though there hadn't been storms the night before, but when I examined her more closely, I saw something that didn't make sense. The animal had been drained almost completely of blood, with puncture wounds on the neck and abdomen that were precise and clean, nothing like what a predator would leave. The carcass was positioned strangely too, moved from where she would normally bed down, arranged in a way that seemed deliberate, with the legs extended in a specific pattern. I called our veterinarian, a man who'd been treating livestock in our community for 30 years, and he examined the cow with increasing confusion. He couldn't explain the blood loss or the nature of the wounds. He suggested maybe it was a large predator I wasn't familiar with, though he admitted he'd never seen anything quite like this either. We buried the cow, and I increased my nighttime checks of the herd, thinking maybe I could catch whatever was killing my animals. 3 nights later, it happened again. Another cow, killed in the same manner, drained and positioned in that same strange pattern with legs extended. This time I noticed something else. The grass around the carcass had been flattened in a circular pattern, as if something had been moving around the body in a deliberate circle. I wasn't the only one experiencing this. Within a week, 3 of my neighbors reported similar livestock deaths. Cows, goats, even chickens, all killed in the same way, all drained of blood, all positioned in patterns that seemed intentional rather than random. Our community started organizing night watches, groups of farmers taking turns patrolling properties, armed with flashlights and shotguns, determined to protect our animals and catch whatever predator was targeting us. I joined the watch rotation along with my neighbors Ayan and Nixon, both men I'd known since childhood, both experienced farmers who understood livestock and predators. We set up our watch on my property on a Thursday night in early October. The 3 of us positioned ourselves in my barn with a clear view of the pasture where my remaining cattle were grazing. We had thermoses of coffee, flashlights, and my shotgun loaded with buckshot. The night was cool and clear, a half moon providing enough light to see the general shapes of the landscape. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The cattle grazed peacefully, occasionally lying down, behaving normally. We talked quietly about crops and weather and community news, the ordinary conversations of men who've known each other their entire lives. Around 2 in the morning, the cattle started acting strange. They bunched together in the center of the pasture, all facing the same direction toward the cornfield that bordered my property, on the eastern side. Their bodies were tense, alert, the way animals get when they sense a predator nearby. We stopped talking and watched carefully. The corn was mature, ready for harvest, standing maybe 8 feet tall and creating a wall of dense vegetation. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then we saw it. Movement in the corn, something large pushing through the stalks, creating a disturbance we could track by watching the tops of the plants sway and bend. Ayan pointed it out, his voice barely a whisper. And we all saw it then. Whatever was in that cornfield was big, tall enough that we could see the disturbance it created 6 or 7 feet up the stalks. It was moving along the edge of the field, parallel to the fence line, and it seemed to be observing the cattle rather than attacking. We watched it for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The cattle remained bunched and frozen, watching that movement in the corn with the kind of primal fear that animals show when they encounter something fundamentally wrong. Then it emerged from the corn, and what we saw made no sense at all. The shape was roughly humanoid, upright on 2 legs, but the proportions were completely wrong. Too tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, with limbs that were too long and jointed in ways that didn't match human anatomy. The moonlight wasn't strong enough to see details clearly, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, but the way it moved was profoundly disturbing, fluid and deliberate, but wrong, like watching someone walk in a film played at the wrong speed. It stood at the edge of the cornfield for a long moment, and I had the distinct impression it was studying us as much as we were studying it, that it knew we were in the barn watching. Nixon raised his flashlight and was about to turn it on when Ion grabbed his arm and stopped him. He whispered that we should stay quiet and observe, that maybe it would move on if it didn't feel threatened. The thing at the cornfield edge shifted its position, and I saw its head turn toward the barn, toward us specifically. It had noticed Ion stopping Nixon, had reacted to that small movement. It was intelligent, aware, strategic. That realization terrified me more than anything else. This wasn't just an animal operating on instinct. This was something that could think, could plan, could observe and adapt its behavior. We sat frozen in that barn while the thing circled around the perimeter of the pasture, staying in the shadows, never fully entering the open space where the cattle huddled. It moved all the way around, taking maybe 20 minutes to complete a full circuit, and then it disappeared back into the cornfield on the far side of my property. The cattle remained bunched and terrified for another hour before they finally started to relax and disperse. None of us spoke until dawn started to lighten the eastern sky. When we finally felt safe enough to leave the barn and examine the property, we found tracks in the soft earth along the fence line. The tracks were like nothing I'd ever seen. They were vaguely foot-shaped but elongated, maybe 16 inches long, with what looked like 3 or 4 toe impressions at the front. The stride length between prints was enormous, at least 6 feet, suggesting something with legs far longer than a human's. We followed the tracks into the cornfield and found where they led to an area where the corn had been trampled down in a rough circle, a space large enough for something man-sized to have been resting or waiting. Nixon wanted to follow the tracks further to see where they led, but Ayan argued against it. He said we should bring this to the community elders, that this was beyond what 3 farmers could handle alone. That evening, we gathered with about 15 other men from our community at the meeting house. We described what we'd seen, and other farmers shared their own observations from the past 2 weeks. Several had seen similar disturbances in their fields. One man had found tracks identical to what we'd discovered. Another had heard sounds at night that he couldn't identify, vocalizations that sounded almost human but distorted, wrong. The oldest man in our community, a bishop named Eugene who was in his 80s, listened to all of this with an expression I couldn't quite read. When everyone had finished sharing, he spoke. He told us this had happened before, that there were records in the community going back to 1952 of similar events. Livestock killed and drained, something large moving through fields at night, tracks that didn't match any known animal. It had lasted exactly 19 days in 1952, then stopped as suddenly as it started. It happened again in 1987, another 19 days of killings and sightings, then nothing. He said the elders at that time had searched for explanations, had consulted with biologists and wildlife experts, but no one could identify what was responsible. The pattern suggested something that returned on a cycle, something that needed to feed or hunt for a specific period and then departed or went dormant. He told us to protect our livestock as best we could, to stay vigilant, but not to pursue or confront whatever this was directly. It would leave on its own when its cycle was complete. Over the next 2 weeks, the killings continued. I lost 3 more cattle, and my neighbors lost animals as well. We organized better watches, kept lights burning in pastures at night, brought vulnerable livestock into barns. Several more people saw the thing moving through fields, always at a distance, always observing rather than attacking directly. The community was tense, fearful, but also resigned. Eugene's words carried weight, and if he said this would pass after 19 days, we believed him. On the 18th night, I was on watch alone when I saw it one final time. It emerged from the corn around midnight and walked directly toward my barn, closer than it had ever come before. I could see it more clearly under the yard lights I'd set up. The body was vaguely humanoid, but covered in something dark, skin or hair or both, and the face, if you could call it that, was elongated and featureless in the darkness. It stopped about 30 feet from the barn and stood there. And again, I had that overwhelming sense that it was intelligent, that it was examining me, memorizing me, understanding me on some level I couldn't comprehend. We stayed like that for several minutes, predator and prey staring at each other across that small distance. Then it turned and walked back into the corn, and I never saw it again. The next morning was the 19th day since the killings began, and they stopped. No more dead livestock, no more tracks, no more sightings. Whatever it was had completed its cycle and moved on, just as Eugene had predicted. Life gradually returned to normal in our community. We never reported any of this to outside authorities because what would we say? That something impossible had spent 19 days hunting our livestock and then disappeared. We handled it ourselves, supported each other through the losses, and kept the knowledge within our community. I still farm that land, still plant corn every spring, and harvest it every fall. But I'm careful now in ways I wasn't before. I don't work alone in fields after dark. I pay attention to the dates, marking September in my mind and watching for any signs that the cycle might be returning. It's been 7 years since 2017, and if the pattern holds, if it truly operates on a 35-year cycle like Eugene suggested, then it won't return until 2052. I'll be 63 then, and I wonder if I'll still be farming, still living on this land, still remembering the autumn when something impossible walked through my cornfields and reminded me that there are things in this world that don't fit into our understanding of nature and reality. Have you ever witnessed something on your property that completely defied logical explanation? Tell me what you saw in the comments. My name is Cassandra, and I've spent the last 8 years trying to understand what happened to me in Brownsville, Pennsylvania during the fall of 2016. I was 26 then, working as a freelance photographer with a focus on documentary work and urban decay. I'd built a modest portfolio photographing abandoned factories, closed coal mines, and dying Rust Belt towns across the Midwest and Appalachia. The work was personal for me, a way of documenting the slow collapse of industrial America before these structures disappeared entirely. Brownsville caught my attention because it had everything I looked for in a subject. A once thriving steel and coal town on the Monongahela River that had been hollowed out by economic decline, leaving behind magnificent ruins and a population that had shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. I'd secured a small grant to create a photo series on defunct steel mills, and the old LTV steel mill in Brownsville was perfect. The facility had closed in the early 90s after operating for nearly a century, and the buildings had been left to decay for over 2 decades. Chain-link fences surrounded the property. Warning signs about trespassing and structural hazards were posted everywhere, but urban explorers and photographers routinely ignored these barriers. I'd done my research, studied satellite images, identified entry points, and planned my shoot for late October when the autumn light would be ideal. I drove out from Pittsburgh on a Thursday morning, arriving in Brownsville around 10 with my camera equipment and a backpack containing water, snacks, and backup batteries. The mill complex was enormous, sprawling across maybe 40 acres along the riverbank. Massive buildings constructed of brick and steel, some several stories tall with broken windows and collapsed sections of roof. Rusted equipment sat frozen in place. Enormous machines that had once processed molten metal now slowly being reclaimed by vegetation and weather. I spent the first few hours photographing exterior shots, capturing the scale and desolation of the place, the way nature was slowly consuming these monuments to industry. The light was perfect, filtered through clouds that created dramatic shadows across the rusted metal and crumbling brick. Around 2 in the afternoon, I entered one of the main processing buildings through a ground-level window that had been broken out by previous explorers. Inside was a cathedral of decay, soaring ceilings supported by massive steel beams, concrete floors cracked and littered with debris, graffiti covering many surfaces. The space felt apocalyptic, frozen in time at the moment of abandonment. I worked methodically, shooting from different angles, playing with composition and light, completely absorbed in my craft. I took hundreds of shots over the next several hours, moving deeper into the complex, exploring different buildings and levels. That evening, back at my hotel room in town, I downloaded the day's work onto my laptop to review what I'd captured. This was standard procedure for me, checking the images while the shoot was still fresh in my mind, making notes about what worked and what I needed to improve. I started clicking through the photos in chronological order, pleased with what I was seeing, when I noticed something odd in one of the wide-angle shots I'd taken inside the main processing building. In the background, perhaps 50 feet behind where I'd been standing, there was a figure, a human shape, standing motionless among the industrial wreckage, partially obscured by a support column, but definitely there. I zoomed in on the figure, enhancing the image as much as the resolution would allow. It appeared to be a person, average height, wearing what looked like dark clothing, facing toward where I'd been shooting. I had no memory of seeing anyone in that building while I was there. The place had felt completely empty, and I would have noticed another person. I told myself it must have been a shadow or a trick of light that resembled a human form, though even as I thought this, I knew it wasn't true. The figure had clearly defined edges, a recognizable human silhouette. I continued reviewing the rest of my photos, and my unease grew into genuine fear. The figure appeared in multiple shots, always in the background, always at a distance but progressively closer. In the first image where I noticed it, the figure was perhaps 50 feet away. In a photo taken 10 minutes later, according to the metadata, it was maybe 40 feet away, then 30 feet, then 20. I could track its approach through my photographs, watching it move closer as I'd worked, completely unaware of its presence. In the later photos, I could see more detail. The figure wasn't just standing anymore, but appeared to be observing me directly, and there was something wrong about its proportions, something subtly off that I couldn't quite identify. I felt sick to my stomach, thinking about how I'd spent hours in that abandoned mill with something or someone following me, watching me, getting closer while I remained oblivious. I looked through every single photo from that day, over 400 images, and the figure appeared in 63 of them, always in the background, always observing. In a few shots, I could see what might have been a face, pale and indistinct, but the details were too unclear to make out features. I didn't sleep that night, sitting up with my laptop, obsessively reviewing the images, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The next morning, I did something I know was foolish, but felt necessary. I drove back to the mill with my camera, intending to shoot in the exact same locations to prove to myself that the figure had been some kind of optical illusion or artifact of light and shadow. I told myself that if I went back and took the same shots, I'd see the same shapes and realize it was nothing. I entered through the same window, moved to the same spot where I'd taken that first image showing the figure, and composed an identical shot. Before I pressed the shutter, I scanned the entire space visually, confirming I was alone in that vast building. I took the photo, then immediately reviewed it on my camera's display screen. The figure was there, in almost the exact same position as yesterday, standing in the background near that support column. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the camera. I looked up from the screen, staring at the physical space where the figure appeared in the photograph, and saw nothing. Empty space, concrete and metal, shadows and debris, but no person. I looked back at the camera screen, and the figure was still there in the image. I took another photo, same composition, and again the figure appeared in the digital image but was completely invisible to my naked eye. I should have left immediately, but fear had transformed into something else. a desperate need to understand what was happening. I moved to a different location in the building, set up a new shot, and before taking it, I stared hard at the space I was about to photograph, memorizing every detail. Then I took the photo and looked at the screen. The figure was in this image too, but in a different location now, closer to where I was standing, maybe 15 feet away. I looked up at that physical location and still saw nothing. But when I raised the camera again and looked through the viewfinder in real time, there it was. The figure, visible only through my camera, standing motionless, watching me. I started backing toward the exit, camera still raised, viewfinder to my eye, because somehow seeing it felt safer than not knowing where it was. The figure began to move, not walking but shifting position in a way that didn't involve normal locomotion, appearing closer in sequential moments, as if skipping forward through space. 10 feet away, then 8, then 5. I could see details now that made my mind reject what my eyes were telling me. The face was wrong, features blurred or absent, and the body seemed to phase between solid and transparent, like I was seeing something that existed partially in my reality and partially somewhere else. When it was maybe 3 feet away, I felt something I can only describe as breath on my face, cold air that smelled like metal and chemicals and decay. I pulled the camera away from my eye, and the figure vanished from my direct vision, but I could still feel its presence, still feel that wrongness in the space directly in front of me. I ran. I dropped my camera bag, didn't care about my expensive equipment, just ran for that broken window I'd entered through. I could hear nothing behind me, no footsteps, no sounds of pursuit, but I felt something following, felt it tracking my movement through that building. I made it outside, sprinted across the mill grounds to where I'd parked, drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles outside of Brownsville, pulled over in a gas station parking lot, hyperventilating and shaking. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I checked my camera, the one I'd kept with me because it had been around my neck. The memory card held 17 photos from that second visit to the mill. I almost deleted them without looking, but some compulsion made me review them first. The figure appeared in all of them, getting progressively closer, and in the final image, the one I'd taken just before running, it was directly in front of the camera, perhaps inches from the lens. The face, if you could call it that, filled most of the frame. I could see what might have been eyes, dark voids in a pale surface, and something like a mouth, open but empty. But worse than the image itself was what I noticed in the metadata. The camera had registered the correct date and time, the correct location coordinates, but the exposure settings were impossible. The image showed a properly exposed photograph, but according to the camera's data, the shutter speed had been impossibly long, several full seconds, and the aperture had been set to values that didn't exist on my lens. The camera had recorded something that violated the basic physics of photography. I never went back to Brownsville. I couldn't bring myself to return to that mill or even drive through that town. I finished my grant project using photographs from other locations, never mentioned what had happened, never showed anyone those final 17 images, but I kept them, stored on an encrypted drive, because they were proof that I hadn't imagined it. For months afterward, I was terrified to review any of my photographs, afraid I'd see that figure lurking in the background of images taken in other locations. I developed an obsessive habit of checking every photo immediately after taking it, scanning the background for any sign of that presence. It never appeared again, not in any photograph I've taken in the 8 years since Brownsville. I've tried to research similar experiences, looking for other photographers who've encountered something impossible while documenting abandoned places, but I've found nothing definitive. Plenty of ghost stories and urban legends, but nothing that matched my specific experience of something that existed only through the camera lens, something that could move through space in ways that defied physics. I've developed theories over the years, mostly late at night when I can't sleep, and my mind circles back to that October day. Maybe certain locations, places saturated with industrial chemicals and human suffering and decades of decay, create conditions where reality becomes thin enough that things from somewhere else can partially manifest. Maybe cameras, with their ability to capture wavelengths of light beyond human vision, can sometimes record things our eyes can't process. I still work as a photographer, but I've shifted away from abandoned industrial sites. I shoot landscapes now, natural spaces, places that feel clean and alive rather than dead and toxic. Sometimes I wonder if that figure is still there in that mill, waiting in the shadows, visible only to those who look through lenses and sensors. And I wonder how many other photographers have encountered it over the years, without realizing what they'd captured until they reviewed their images later, in the safety of home, too late to ask the questions that need asking. Have you ever captured something in a photograph that you're absolutely certain wasn't visible when you took the shot? Drop your story in the comments. My name is Tiana, and what happened to me on a November evening in 2011 has made me question everything I thought I understood about safety and privacy. I was 16 years old then, a junior at the high school in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, a beautiful historic town built into the mountains of Carbon County. Jim Thorpe is known for its Victorian architecture, scenic views, and coal mining history. The kind of place that tourists visit on weekends to walk around and take pictures. I'd lived there my entire life, knew practically everyone in town, felt completely safe in a way that small-town kids often do. I babysat regularly for families in our community, earning money for gas and clothes and the things teenagers want. The family I babysat for most often was the Harrisons, who I knew through church. They had 2 children, ages 5 and 7, sweet kids who were easy to watch. That particular evening, the Harrisons had asked me to babysit while they drove to Allentown for dinner and a show about 45 minutes away. They expected to be home around 11. I arrived at their house around 5:30, a large Victorian on one of the hillside streets with a view of the town below. It was the kind of house that would be featured in magazines, beautifully restored with period details, high ceilings, elaborate woodwork, and that specific creaky charm of buildings constructed in the 1890s. The children and I had dinner, played some board games, and I got them ready for bed around 8. They were asleep by 8:30, and I settled into the living room with my homework, occasionally checking my phone and watching television with the volume low. Around 9 o'clock, I went into the kitchen to get water and noticed a piece of paper on the counter that I was certain hadn't been there earlier. It was a small sheet of white notebook paper folded in half, and when I opened it, I saw handwritten text in blue ink that read, "Check the basement door at 9:47. Nothing else, just that single instruction with a very specific time. My first thought was that Mrs. Harrison had left me a note about some household task, maybe something related to the furnace or laundry, though the specific time seemed odd. I looked around the kitchen for other notes, thinking maybe I'd missed something when I first arrived, but found nothing. I tried calling Mrs. Harrison's cell phone to ask about the note, but it went straight to voicemail. They were probably in the theater by now with their phones turned off. I looked at the note again, studying the handwriting. It didn't quite match Mrs. Harrison's writing from what I remembered seeing on grocery lists and permission slips. The letters were more angular, more precise, almost mechanical in their consistency. A feeling of unease settled into my stomach, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Mr. Harrison had left the note, or maybe Mrs. Harrison's handwriting just looked different when she wrote quickly. The specific time bothered me though. Why 9:47? Why not 9:45 or 9:30 or just tonight? The precision felt intentional, meaningful in a way I couldn't identify. I sat in the living room with the note in my hand, watching the clock on the mantel move toward 9:47. Part of me wanted to ignore the instruction entirely, to throw the note away and pretend I'd never seen it. But another part of me was curious and concerned. What if something really was wrong with the basement door? Some kind of leak or mechanical problem that needed attention at a specific time. As 9:47 approached, I got up and walked through the house to the basement door, which was located in a small hallway off the kitchen. I'd never been in the Harrisons' basement, had never had any reason to go down there during my previous babysitting visits. I reached the door at exactly 9:47, according to my phone. I stood there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, feeling foolish and frightened simultaneously. Then I turned the knob and pulled. The door opened easily, and I immediately noticed something wrong. The basement door had been locked earlier in the evening. I specifically remembered checking all the doors when I first arrived, because Mrs. Harrison always asked me to make sure everything was secured. This door had been locked, I was certain of it, but now it opened freely. I flipped the light switch at the top of the stairs, and a bare bulb illuminated wooden steps descending into darkness. I called down, asking if anyone was there, my voice sounding small and uncertain. No response. I started down the stairs slowly, phone in hand with the flashlight app activated, even though the basement bulb provided some illumination. The basement was unfinished, concrete floor, and stone foundation walls, cluttered with the typical accumulation of household storage. Boxes, old furniture, holiday decorations, children's toys that had been outgrown. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed muddy footprints on the concrete floor, distinct boot prints that led from the stairs to a far corner of the basement and back again. The prints were fresh, the mud not yet dried. I followed them with my flashlight, and they led to a crawlspace entrance, a small opening in the foundation wall that I hadn't noticed at first. The opening was maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, large enough for a person to squeeze through, and it led to the space beneath the front porch. I knelt down and shined my light into the crawlspace. What I saw made my blood turn cold. Someone had been living there. There was a sleeping bag spread out on the dirt floor, several water bottles both empty and full, a battery-operated camping lantern, and food wrappers. There were other items too, more disturbing things that made the situation clear. A notebook with handwritten observations, a pair of binoculars, and photographs. Photographs of the Harrison family, candid shots taken through, windows, images of the children playing in the yard, pictures of Mrs. Harrison hanging laundry, photos of the family eating dinner visible through their dining room window. I scrambled backward from the crawlspace, nearly falling in my panic, and ran for the stairs. I was halfway up when I heard a sound behind me, a scraping noise from the direction of the crawlspace, the sound of something moving. I didn't look back, just ran up the stairs and slammed the basement door behind me. I tried my phone again, calling Mrs. Harrison, then Mr. Harrison, then finally dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator answered, and I tried to explain the situation, that I was babysitting and someone had been living in the crawlspace, that there were footprints and photographs and evidence that someone had been watching the family. The operator told me to take the children and leave the house immediately, to go to a neighbor's house and wait for police there. I ran upstairs, woke both kids, told them we needed to go visit a neighbor right away, and made it sound like an adventure rather than an emergency because I didn't want to terrify them. I got them into their coats and shoes, grabbed my things, and we left through the front door. I took them to the house across the street, an elderly couple I'd seen the Harrisons talk to, and explained that there was an emergency and police were coming. The neighbors took us in, gave the children cookies and milk, and we waited. 3 police cars arrived within 10 minutes. Officers went into the Harrison house, searched it thoroughly, and confirmed everything I'd reported. Someone had indeed been living in the crawlspace, had been there for an extended period based on the amount of supplies and waste they found. The notebook contained detailed observations about the family's routine, when parents left for work, when children went to school, when the house was typically empty. The photographs numbered in the hundreds, a complete surveillance record going back weeks or possibly months. The officers found evidence that whoever had been staying there had been entering the main house regularly, accessing the kitchen and other areas while the family was gone or asleep. The most disturbing discovery was that they found more notes, dozens of them, hidden throughout the house in places the family would never normally look. Behind picture frames, tucked into book spines, under furniture, all containing similar instructions or observations written in that same precise handwriting. The note I'd found on the kitchen counter had been placed there sometime between when I'd arrived and 9 o'clock, meaning whoever had been living in the crawlspace had been moving through the house that evening while I was there with the children, watching us, planting that note, possibly testing me or taunting me. The Harrisons arrived home around 11:30 to find their house surrounded by police vehicles. Mrs. Harrison broke down when officers explained what had been happening. They'd had no idea, no sense that anything was wrong, no awareness that someone had been systematically stalking their family and living literally beneath their feet. Police launched an investigation to identify the stalker, processing the evidence found in the crawlspace, but they never made an arrest. Whoever had been staying there had left no useful DNA evidence, no fingerprints that matched anyone in the system, no identification. The handwriting analysis and photographs suggested someone with obsessive tendencies and possible mental illness, but without a suspect, the investigation eventually went cold. The Harrison family moved out of that house within a month. They couldn't stay there, couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening beneath them, couldn't feel safe in a home that had been violated so thoroughly. They relocated to a different town, and I heard later that they'd sold the Victorian house at a significant loss because they couldn't bear to spend another night there. I stopped babysitting after that incident. My parents didn't forbid it, but I couldn't bring myself to stay alone in someone else's house at night, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone might be hiding in places I'd never think to check. The question that haunted me then and still haunts me now is how long it had been going on. The amount of supplies and the number of photographs suggested weeks or months of surveillance and habitation. How many times had the family been home, sleeping in their beds, eating dinner, living their normal lives, while someone crouched in the crawlspace below, listening to their footsteps and their conversations? How many times had this person moved through the house while they slept, observing them, photographing them, leaving notes that were never found? And the note that brought me to the basement at exactly 9:47, what was the purpose? Was it a warning, a game, a way of revealing themselves, or something else entirely? I'm 29 now, living in Philadelphia, working as a paralegal, far removed from that November night in Jim Thorpe. But I still think about it, especially when I'm alone in my apartment at night. I check my locks obsessively, examine my space for any sign that someone has been there when I was gone, look for notes or evidence of intrusion. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors, probably more than necessary, but I can't help it. The knowledge that someone can invade your space, your home, the place where you should feel safest, and remain undetected for extended periods while they watch and document your life, that knowledge changes you fundamentally. You never feel completely secure again. You never stop wondering if those small things you notice, the item that's not quite where you left it, the door that seems different, the feeling of being observed, might actually be real rather than paranoia. The police told the Harrisons they were lucky that this kind of stalking and invasion often escalates to violence, that whoever had been living there might have eventually acted on their obsession in more direct and harmful ways. The fact that I discovered them that night, that the note had led me to the basement at the exact moment when evidence was freshest, possibly interrupted whatever progression was happening. But I've never been able to understand that note. How did the stalker know I would check the basement at 9:47? How did they know I would find the note and follow its instruction? Unless they'd been watching me specifically that evening, tracking my movements through the house, waiting for the right moment to place the note where I would see it. That possibility is almost worse than everything else, The idea that I'd been as much a target of observation that night as the family I was protecting. If you've ever house sat or babysat, have you found anything that made you realize someone had been there who shouldn't have been? Share what happened in the comments. My name is Stanley, and I'm going to tell you about a decision I made 17 years ago that destroyed my life in ways I'm still discovering. In 2007, I was 35 years old, living in Titusville, Pennsylvania, a town in Crawford County that had once been at the center of America's first oil boom, but had long since fallen into economic decline. I'd worked in the oil industry my whole adult life, following my father into the refineries and drilling operations that still existed in the region, though on a much smaller scale than the glory days of the 1800s. By 2007, those jobs were mostly gone. The refinery where I'd worked for 12 years had closed, and I'd been unemployed for 8 months, burning through my savings, watching my marriage fall apart, facing foreclosure on the house I'd bought when times were good. I was at the absolute lowest point of my existence that October. My wife had left me in September, taking our 2 kids and moving in with her parents in Erie. The bank had sent final notice on the mortgage. I had maybe $300 in my checking account and no prospects for employment in a town where the primary industry had been dead for decades. I'd applied for jobs everywhere within a 100-mile radius, anything that would pay enough to survive on. But I was 35 with a high school education and experience in a dying field. Nobody was hiring. I'd started drinking heavily, spending my last money on cheap whiskey, sitting alone in a house that would soon belong to the bank, contemplating actions I'm ashamed to admit I considered. On a Friday night in late October, I drove out to a rural crossroads about 10 miles outside of town, a place where 2 county roads intersected in the middle of farmland and forest. I'd brought a bottle with me and a pistol I'd inherited from my father, and I sat in my truck at that crossroads, drinking and working up the courage to end everything. I know how that sounds, and I'm not proud of it. But I want you to understand the mental state I was in, the absolute desperation and hopelessness that had consumed me. I genuinely believed that everyone in my life would be better off without me, that my death would at least provide some insurance money for my kids, that continuing to exist was pointless when I'd lost everything that mattered. I was sitting there in the darkness around midnight, the pistol on the seat beside me, when someone knocked on my truck window. I nearly jumped out of my skin because I'd been watching the road and hadn't seen anyone approach, hadn't seen any other vehicles. I looked out and saw a man standing beside my truck, middle-aged, average build, wearing ordinary clothes. Nothing remarkable about him except that he'd appeared out of nowhere on an empty road in the middle of the night. I rolled down my window and he smiled at me, a pleasant, friendly smile that seemed completely out of place given the circumstances. He asked if I was having trouble, if my truck had broken down, just making normal conversation like someone trying to help a stranded motorist. I told him no, I was fine, just needed to be alone for a while. He nodded like he understood perfectly, then asked if I was sure, because he could help me if I needed it. There was something in the way he said help that made me pay attention, an emphasis that suggested he meant more than just mechanical assistance. I stared at him, and he looked back at me with eyes that seemed too knowing, too aware of exactly what I'd been contemplating. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said he could see I was at a crossroads in more ways than one, that I was facing a choice about whether to continue, and he wanted me to know that there were other options. He said he could make my problems go away, could give me the prosperity and success I desperately needed, could restore everything I'd lost and more. All he required in exchange was something of equivalent value, something that wouldn't be missed immediately, but would balance the scales. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, like he was discussing a business transaction, rather than something that made no rational sense. I should have driven away. Every instinct should have been screaming at me that this was wrong, that this man appearing out of nowhere at midnight offering supernatural solutions was dangerous. but I was drunk and desperate and broken enough that I listened. I asked him what he wanted in exchange, what equivalent payment meant, and he said that would be determined based on what he provided. He said the universe required balance, that nothing came without cost, and that if he gave me prosperity, something of equal value would be taken to maintain equilibrium. He made it sound reasonable, almost scientific, like he was explaining natural law rather than making a devil's bargain. I said yes. I don't even remember the exact words I used, just that I agreed to his terms, accepted his offer, shook his hand when he extended it through my truck window. His hand was cold, unnaturally cold, like touching meat that had been frozen, but I ignored that detail. He smiled again, told me things would begin improving immediately, and walked away into the darkness. I watched him go, and he simply vanished after about 20 feet, didn't walk down the road or into the trees, just ceased to exist. I sat there for another hour trying to process what had happened, eventually convincing myself I'd hallucinated the entire encounter, that the combination of alcohol and despair had created a vivid delusion. But things did improve, immediately and dramatically. That Monday, I received a call from a company in Meadville offering me a job managing their small petroleum distribution operation. Better pay than I'd made before, full benefits, starting immediately. That same week, my wife called and said she wanted to try reconciliation, that she'd made a mistake leaving. The bank contacted me about a mortgage modification program I qualified for that would prevent foreclosure. Within a month, everything in my life had turned around. I was employed, my marriage was healing, my financial problems were resolving. I convinced myself the encounter at the crossroads had been a stress-induced hallucination, that my improved circumstances were just coincidental good luck. Exactly 1 year later, on the anniversary of that October night, my younger brother died. He was 32, healthy, no history of medical problems, and he had a massive heart attack while sitting at his kitchen table eating breakfast. The doctors couldn't explain it, said sometimes these things just happen, but I knew. I knew with absolute certainty that this was the payment, the equivalent value taken to balance what I'd received. My brother's life in exchange for my prosperity. I was devastated, consumed by guilt, but I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I couldn't have known, that I'd been drunk and desperate, that I wasn't really responsible for what had happened. The next year, on the same date, my mother died. She was 62, diagnosed with aggressive cancer in September, and dead by October, 6 weeks from diagnosis to death. The pattern was undeniable now. Every anniversary of my bargain, someone close to me died. The third year, it was my father-in-law, a man I'd known and respected for 15 years, killed in a car accident that witnesses said was impossible. His vehicle simply veered off the road for no apparent reason. The fourth year, my best friend from childhood, drowned in a boating accident despite being an experienced swimmer. The fifth year, my older sister, aneurysm in her sleep. Year after year, the payment came due, and I watched people I loved die while my own life continued to prosper. My career advanced, promotions and opportunities appearing regularly. My financial situation became comfortable, then genuinely wealthy, through investments that shouldn't have succeeded but did. But I was paying for it with the lives of everyone close to me, watching my circle of loved ones shrink annually as the balance was maintained. I tried to break it, tried to refuse the prosperity, gave away money, quit good jobs, deliberately sabotaged my own success, but it made no difference. The prosperity returned regardless of what I did, and the deaths continued on schedule. My wife never made the connection, never realized the pattern, but I couldn't tell her the truth. How do you explain to someone that you sold your soul for prosperity and everyone around you is dying as payment? She grieved each loss, thinking they were natural tragedies, terrible luck, while I carried the knowledge that I'd caused every single death. The guilt became unbearable. I started drinking again heavily, trying to numb the awareness of what I'd done. My marriage collapsed again, this time permanently, but even my ex-wife's departure from my life probably saved her. The deaths only affected people I maintained close emotional connections with. I stopped forming relationships, stopped getting close to anyone, isolated myself completely to protect others from becoming payment. For the last 8 years, I've lived alone in Titusville, working remotely, avoiding personal connections, watching the calendar every October with dread and relief when the date passes, and I've lost no one because there's no one left to lose.